Julian Voss had never set foot in a town like Marlow before. To him, places like this existed only in passing glimpses from train windows, blurry clusters of low rooftops, weathered signs, and quiet streets that seemed to exhale rather than bustle. He'd come here on the advice of his manager, who insisted he needed a mental reset before his upcoming European tour. "You're wound tighter than a metronome at Presto," she'd said, only half joking. So, against his better judgment, Julian had agreed to spend 10 days in this sleepy coastal village, trading concert halls for cobblestone lanes and 5-star hotels for a modest guest house with creaky floorboards and a view of the harbor. From the moment he arrived, Julian felt out of place. Not in an uncomfortable way. He was used to being the odd one out, but in a way that unsettled his sense of order. In his world, everything had its place. Sheet music aligned just so, pianos tuned to concert pitch, audiences seated in respectful silence. Here life seemed to spill over its edges. Children chased seagulls down the pier. Shopkeepers called out greetings across the street, and the scent of salt, bread, and wet earth mingled in the air like an uncomposed melody. It was messy, and Julian, who prided himself on precision, found it faintly irritating. He spent his first 2 days walking the same route each morning, down Harbor Lane, past the bakery with its fogged-up windows, around the small park with its rusted swing set, and back along the seawall where fishermen mended their nets. He carried a notebook not to write music, though he told himself he might, but mostly to look occupied. He didn't speak to anyone. He nodded politely when someone said good morning, but his eyes stayed distant, already rehearsing the opening bars of the Liszt sonata he planned to perform in Vienna. On the third evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in soft purples and oranges, Julian took a different turn. A narrow alley led him to a building he hadn't noticed before. A low, whitewashed structure with peeling blue shutters and a sign that read, Marlow Community Center. Through an open window on the ground floor, light spilled onto the damp pavement. And from inside came the sound of piano music. Julian stopped. He wasn't sure why. It wasn't particularly loud or dramatic. In fact, it was so quiet he almost missed it over the distant crash of waves. But something about it made him pause, like a single out-of-tune note in an otherwise perfect chord. He stepped closer, careful not to be seen, and peered through the window. Inside, a woman sat at an old upright piano, its wood scratched and yellowed with age. She wasn't young, but not old either. Somewhere in her late 20s, maybe. She wore a simple cotton dress and had her hair tied back loosely, strands escaping around her face. Her hands moved over the keys with a kind of gentle urgency, as if she were speaking to someone who could only understand music. Around her, a small group had gathered. 2 elderly men in worn cardigans, a woman knitting in a rocking chair, and 3 children sitting cross-legged on the floor, their eyes wide and still. The piece she played was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Julian knew it by heart. He'd performed it at Carnegie Hall at 22. But this version, it wasn't correct. The tempo was slower than marked. She lingered too long on certain notes, rushed others. There was a slight stumble in the left hand during the middle section. To Julian's trained ear, it was riddled with flaws. And yet, there was something in the way she shaped each phrase, like she wasn't just playing notes but remembering something. A moment, a person, a feeling. The music didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a gift. Julian frowned. He didn't like that thought. Music wasn't a gift. It was a discipline. A craft honed through years of sacrifice, isolation, and relentless practice. It wasn't something you just gave away in a room full of strangers on a Tuesday evening. He turned away sharply as if the sight offended him. Back at his guest house, he poured himself a glass of water, no alcohol, never before a performance, and sat at the small writing desk. He opened his notebook and tried to sketch out a new interpretation of the Liszt piece, but the woman's playing kept echoing in his mind. Not the mistakes, the feeling behind them. The next morning, he read in the local paper that the Marlow Library was hosting a Meet the Artist talk with a visiting pianist. He almost skipped it. What could this town possibly offer in the way of musical insight? But curiosity, or perhaps pride, nudged him to go. The library was small, with wooden shelves that smelled of old paper and lemon oil. About 30 people had gathered in the reading room, seated on folding chairs. Julian sat near the back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. The librarian, a cheerful woman with silver hair, introduced him as the internationally acclaimed Julian Voss, and the room gave a polite round of applause. He spoke for 20 minutes, calmly, precisely about technique, interpretation, and the importance of historical context in classical performance. He answered a few questions. Then during the open floor, a voice came from the middle row. "What about music that isn't perfect? Does it still have value?" Julian turned. It was her, the woman from the community center. She stood now, holding a tote bag with wildflowers sticking out the top. Her eyes met his, not challengingly, but with quiet sincerity. He hesitated. "Music," he said carefully, "is an art form built on centuries of refinement. When we disregard fundamentals, timing, dynamics, structure, we risk reducing it to mere noise. Sentimentality has its place, of course, but it shouldn't replace skill." A few people shifted in their seats. The woman didn't flinch. "But isn't music also about connection? My grandmother couldn't read a single note, but when she hummed old songs, it made people feel seen. Isn't that part of music too?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Feeling seen doesn't make one a musician," he said, his tone cooler now. "Just as owning a paintbrush doesn't make one an artist." The room fell silent. The librarian quickly stepped in. "Well, thank you both for such thoughtful perspectives." Afterward, as Julian walked out, he heard murmurs behind him. Some agreeing with him, others clearly not. He told himself he didn't care. But then, as he passed the flower shop near the square, he saw her arranging bouquets behind the glass. A sign above the door read, "Finch and Stem." So her name was Finch. Ilara Finch, he'd later learn. That evening, over dinner at the only decent restaurant in town, Julian found himself replaying the exchange. He told himself she was naive, romantic, dangerous even, because people like her made audiences expect less. They confused emotion with excellence. But the next day, while buying coffee, he overheard two women talking. "Did you hear? That fancy pianist called Ilara's playing noise." He didn't say that exactly. "Well, close enough." "Poor thing. She plays for Mrs. Callahan every Thursday, just to keep her spirits up since her husband passed." "And those kids at the center? They call her Piano Auntie." Julian set his cup down a little too hard. Something inside him, pride perhaps, or wounded ego, twisted. He wasn't used to being the villain. In his world, he was the standard bearer, the guardian of tradition. But here in this tiny town, he was just the rude outsider. So on impulse, he went to the community center the following afternoon. Ilara was there, watering plants near the piano. She looked up, surprised but not unfriendly. "I heard you play," he said, arms still crossed, voice clipped. "You have passion." "But passion isn't enough." She wiped her hands on her apron. "I never said it was." "You're teaching those children," he continued. "Do you even know proper finger positioning? Hand posture?" "I teach them to listen," she said simply. "To find joy in the sound, not fear in the mistake." He scoffed. "Joy without discipline is just chaos." She studied him for a long moment. Then softly, "And discipline without joy is just silence." The words hit him harder than he expected. Before he could respond, a little boy ran in, holding a crumpled drawing. "Auntie Ilara?" "I drew you playing the moon song." She smiled, took the drawing, and ruffled his hair. "It's beautiful, Leo, thank you." Julian stood there, feeling oddly invisible. That night he couldn't sleep. The town was too quiet. Or maybe his mind was too loud. He kept thinking about the boy's drawing, the way Ilara had looked at it like it was a masterpiece. He thought about the elderly woman who came just to hear her play. He thought about his own first piano teacher who had once told him, "Don't play for the judges. Play for the person in the back row who's having the worst day of their life." He hadn't thought of that in years. By morning, a strange idea had taken root. It wasn't noble. It wasn't kind. It was, in truth, arrogant. But it felt like the only way to settle this, to prove once and for all that music belonged to those who had earned it. He went to the town square where a small bulletin board hung outside the post office. He wrote a note in neat, firm handwriting. "Piano Duel. Julian Voss versus Ilara Finch, 1 piece each. Public performance. Marlow Cultural Hall, next Saturday, 7 p.m. Let the music speak for itself." He signed it, pinned it up, and walked away before he could change his mind. Within hours, the whole town knew. People talked about it in the bakery at the docks over garden fences. Some thought it was exciting. Others thought it was cruel. Ilara heard about it from Leo, who ran into her shop breathless. "Auntie, you're gonna play against the fancy pianist." She read the note later that day. Her hands trembled slightly as she unpinned it. She didn't want a duel. She didn't believe music was a competition, but she also knew that if she refused, it would look like she was afraid. And worse, it would confirm everything Julian implied, that her music wasn't real. So, standing in the quiet of her flower shop, surrounded by roses and lavender and the soft hum of bees outside, Ilara Finch made a decision she would play not to win, not to prove anything, but because the music inside her wouldn't let her stay silent. And Julian Voss, sipping black coffee on his guesthouse porch, watched the town stir with anticipation. He told himself this was about standards, about respect for the art. But deep down in a place he rarely visited, he wondered if he was the one who needed to be proven wrong. The week ahead stretched before them both, not as a countdown to a contest, but as a quiet unraveling of everything they thought they knew about music, worth, and the invisible threads that connect one human heart to another. Julian didn't expect the town to take the duel so seriously. To him it had been a statement, a clean, sharp way to draw a line between what he saw as real music and what he dismissed as well-meaning noise. But by the next morning, flyers had appeared in shop windows. Chalk messages decorated the sidewalk outside the cultural hall, and even the local radio station, barely more than a converted garage with a microphone and a playlist of folk songs, announced the event as the musical moment of the decade. He rolled his eyes, but something about the buzz made his stomach tighten. It wasn't fear. It was the uneasy sense that he'd lost control of the narrative. He rented a small practice room above the old bookstore, where an aging baby grand sat beneath a skylight that let in dusty afternoon light. Every morning after breakfast, he walked up the narrow staircase, set his metronome on the piano, and began. He chose Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 Choir, a piece that demanded speed, power, and flawless articulation. It was showy, yes, but also technically merciless. One wrong note, one rushed passage, and the whole illusion of mastery would crumble. That was the point. He wanted to leave no room for doubt. His fingers flew across the keys, precise and relentless. Sweat gathered at his temples. He played the same 6-bar passage over and over until the rhythm was welded into his muscles. Outside, the town carried on, children laughing. Boats honking in the harbor, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. But inside that room, there was only the piano, the silence between notes, and the growing pressure in his chest that he refused to name. Meanwhile, Ilara returned to her routine as if nothing had changed. She opened her flower shop at 7, arranged bouquets for birthdays and funerals, watered the hanging baskets out front, and chatted with neighbors who stopped by for a sprig of rosemary or a word of comfort. But at night, after closing up and tucking her grandmother into bed, she walked to the community center. The piano there was far from perfect. The middle C stuck sometimes, and the pedal squeaked. But it was hers in a way no instrument had ever been. She didn't choose a famous piece. She didn't even choose something written down. Instead, she returned to the lullaby her grandmother used to sing when storms rolled in off the sea. It had no title, no composer, no sheet music. It existed only in memory, in the hum of a tired woman rocking a child through thunder and grief. Ilara had tried to play it once years ago, right after her parents' accident, but she'd broken down halfway through. Now she sat with it again, slowly, patiently, letting her fingers find the shape of the melody the way you might trace the outline of a loved one's face in the dark. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't complex, but every note carried a story. The smell of her mother's lavender soap, the sound of her father whistling while fixing the porch steps, the weight of her grandmother's hand on her back as she cried herself to sleep for months. This music wasn't meant to impress. It was meant to hold. Word of her choice spread quietly. Mrs. Callahan, the widow who came every Thursday, overheard Ilara humming it while arranging daisies and said, "That's the one you played when my Arthur was in the hospital, isn't it?" Ilara nodded. "You played it so soft, like you were tucking him in from afar." The old woman's eyes filled. He smiled that day. First time in weeks. At the bakery, the owner's son, a shy boy who barely spoke, asked if Ilara would play the quiet song again after the duel. "It makes my dreams less scary," he whispered. Ilara didn't tell anyone she was practicing for a competition. She just played, and in doing so, she reminded the town of something it already knew, that music could be a shelter, not a weapon. Julian, of course, heard none of this, but he did notice the change in the air. People still greeted him politely, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. At the cafe, conversations hushed when he entered. Even the bookstore owner, who'd been eager to lend him the practice room, now handed him his change with a tight nod. He told himself it didn't matter. He wasn't here to be liked. He was here to uphold standards. Still, one afternoon, curiosity got the better of him. He walked past the community center just after dusk. The windows were lit. He stood in the shadows across the street and listened. What he heard wasn't the lullaby yet, just scales, simple chords, the sound of someone warming up. But there was a gentleness in the touch, a lack of urgency that unsettled him. He was used to music that demanded attention. This music invited you in. It didn't shout. It whispered. He turned away, jaw clenched. "Sentiment," he muttered to himself. "That's all it is." But later that night, lying awake, he found himself humming a fragment of the melody he'd overheard. He stopped immediately, annoyed. He didn't want to remember it. It had no structure, no development, just a loop of simple notes that seemed to circle back on themselves like a hand reaching out in the dark. The days passed. Julian practiced harder. Ilara played softer. The town held its breath. Then came the interview. A reporter from the regional paper, a young woman with bright eyes and a notebook full of questions, asked Julian for a comment. They sat on a bench near the harbor. "Why challenge Ilara?" she asked gently. "Because music matters," he replied. "And when we lower the bar to make people feel good, we cheapen it." "But what if music isn't about bars? What if it's about bridges?" He looked at her, surprised. "Bridges to what?" "To each other." He didn't answer, but the question stayed with him. That same day, Ilara was interviewed outside her shop. She held a bundle of sunflowers, their faces turned toward the light. "Are you nervous?" the reporter asked. "A little," Ilara admitted, "but not about playing. I'm nervous I won't be able to say what I need to say." "Through music?" She nodded. "Sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes you just need to sit beside someone in their pain and let the notes do the holding." The quote made the front page the next morning. Julian read it over coffee. He wanted to scoff. Instead, he felt a strange pang, like he'd been handed a key to a door he didn't know existed. The night before the duel, he couldn't sleep. He went to the practice room one last time. The moon cast long shadows across the piano. He played his Liszt piece from start to finish, perfect, powerful, cold. When he finished, the silence felt heavier than before. He thought about Ilara, about the way the townspeople spoke of her, not as a performer, but as a presence. Someone who showed up, who listened, who played not for applause but for connection. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not about his skill, never that, but about his understanding. Had he spent so long chasing perfection that he'd forgotten why he started playing in the first place? He remembered being 8 years old, sitting at his first piano, playing a clumsy version of Für Elise for his mother. She'd cried. Not because it was good, but because it was his. Because he'd tried. Because he'd shared something fragile and true. When had he stopped sharing? When had music become armor instead of an offering? He closed the piano lid softly and walked home through the sleeping town. The air smelled of salt and jasmine. Somewhere a dog barked. A window glowed yellow in the distance. Life, quiet and unpolished, went on without fanfare. Back in his room, he stared at the ceiling. He thought about canceling, walking away. But pride, stubborn and deep-rooted, held him in place. He'd made the challenge. Now he had to face it. Across town, Ilara sat by her grandmother's bedside. The old woman was asleep, her breathing slow and even. Ilara held her hand and hummed the lullaby under her breath. She wasn't thinking about winning or losing. She was thinking about how music had carried her through the darkest years, how it had been her companion when grief felt too large to hold alone. She knew Julian saw her as an amateur. Maybe he was right. But she also knew something he didn't, that music doesn't live in concert halls. It lives in kitchens where mothers sing to tired children, in hospital rooms where strangers hold hands, in quiet moments when someone chooses to stay and listen instead of walking away. The next morning, the sky was clear. Seagulls circled above the harbor. The town began to stir, not with excitement, but with a kind of quiet anticipation, as if they sensed this wasn't really about who played better, but about what music was allowed to be. Julian dressed carefully in a dark suit, polished his shoes, and checked his posture in the mirror. He looked every inch the concert pianist, but inside something had shifted. He didn't know it yet, but he was no longer walking into a duel. He was walking into a reckoning, and Alara, in her simple dress with a single white rose pinned to her collar, walked to the cultural hall not as a competitor, but as a witness to her past, her people, and the quiet truth that sometimes the most powerful music is the kind that dares to be tender. Neither of them knew it yet, but by the end of the night, the real performance wouldn't be the one on stage. It would be the moment Julian Voss finally heard what had been playing all along. The Marlow Cultural Hall hadn't seen a crowd like this in years. Folding chairs filled the main room, spilling into the aisles and even onto the small wooden steps near the back. People arrived early, not with the hushed reverence of a concert hall, but with the warm buzz of a community gathering, neighbors greeting each other, children sharing sweets, elders settling in with knitted shawls draped over their shoulders. There was no ticket, no program, no ushers, just an open door and a shared understanding that something important was about to happen. Julian arrived precisely at 6:45 p.m., alone, carrying only a slim folder of sheet music he didn't actually need. He knew his piece by muscle memory. He wore a charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, no tie. His hair was neatly combed, his expression unreadable. As he stepped inside, the chatter softened, not out of awe but out of caution. He nodded once to the librarian, who was adjusting the microphone near the piano, and walked straight to the backstage area, a narrow room with peeling wallpaper and a single mirror. He didn't look at the audience. He didn't want to see their faces. He needed to stay focused, detached, in control. Alara came in through the side door just after 7, her hands tucked into the pockets of a soft gray dress. She carried no music, no folder, no props. Just herself. A few people smiled at her as she passed. Mrs. Callahan gave her a small wave. Leo held up a clumsily drawn sign that read, "Go Auntie Alara." But she didn't stop to acknowledge them. She wasn't nervous in the way most people would be. Her heart beat steadily. She'd made peace with what she was about to do. This wasn't about proving anything to Julian. It was about honoring the people who had carried her, and the music that had carried her through. The librarian stepped onto the small platform and tapped the microphone. "Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Tonight isn't about competition. It's about listening. So let's do just that, with open hearts." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Julian was introduced first. He walked out without fanfare, his steps measured, his posture straight. He bowed slightly, just enough to be polite, and sat at the grand piano that had been brought in specially for the occasion. The instrument gleamed under the soft lights, its black finish reflecting the faces of the audience like a still pond. He placed his hands on the keys, took a breath, and began. From the first note, the room changed. The Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2 where it exploded into the space with thunderous energy, fast, furious, technically dazzling. His fingers danced across the keys with machine-like precision. Trills shimmered, octaves roared, and the cadenzas unfurled like bolts of lightning. It was the kind of performance that would earn standing ovations in Vienna or Paris. Every note was in its rightful place. Every dynamic shift calculated. Every pause perfectly timed, and yet as impressive as it was, something felt distant, like watching a master sculptor carve ice, beautiful but cold. The audience clapped politely when he finished. Some even stood briefly out of respect for the sheer skill on display. But there was no gasp, no tears. No one leaned forward as if their soul had been gently tugged. Julian rose, bowed again, and walked off without looking back. Backstage, he poured himself a glass of water, his hands steady. He told himself he'd done his part. He'd shown them what real music sounded like. Now it was her turn to reveal the gap between passion and proficiency. But as he stood in the shadows, watching Alara walk onto the stage, something in him tensed, not with anticipation, but with a strange, unfamiliar dread. She didn't approach the grand piano. Instead, she walked to the old upright from the community center. which had been wheeled in beside it. She ran a hand over its scratched wood as if greeting an old friend. Then she sat. She didn't rush. She closed her eyes, let the silence settle, and when she finally placed her fingers on the keys, it wasn't with flourish or fanfare, but with the quiet certainty of someone lighting a candle in a dark room. What followed wasn't a performance. It was a confession. The lullaby began simply, a few soft notes in the right hand like footsteps on a quiet path. The left hand joined gently, not with chords, but with a single bass note that hummed like a heartbeat. There were no flourishes, no dramatic crescendos, just a melody that unfolded slowly, tenderly, as if afraid to startle the listener. And then halfway through, her voice joined the piano, not singing loudly, just a whisper of a hum, barely above breath, weaving through the notes like smoke through moonlight. It was the same sound her grandmother used to make, rocking her to sleep after nightmares. The same sound she'd made while holding Leo's hand during his first piano lesson. The same sound that had filled hospital rooms, grieving homes, lonely afternoons. A woman in the third row began to cry, quietly, without shame. An old man reached for his wife's hand and held it tightly. Leo stopped waving his sign and just stared, his eyes wide and wet. Julian, standing in the wings, felt his chest tighten. He'd expected imperfection. He'd braced for it, but this wasn't just imperfect. It was alive. Every slight hesitation, every uneven rhythm, every breath between phrases, it all carried weight. It wasn't about the notes. It was about what lived between them. He thought of his own performances, the standing ovations, the critics' praise, the flawless recordings. And for the first time he wondered, had anyone ever felt seen by his music? Or had they just admired the machinery behind it? Ilara reached the final phrase. She held the last note longer than written, letting it fade into silence like a sigh. Then she lifted her hands. Didn't move. Just sat there, eyes still closed, as if listening to something only she could hear. The room stayed silent for a full 10 seconds. No one clapped. No one spoke. They were still inside the music, still wrapped in its warmth. Then slowly, Mrs. Callahan stood. Not with a burst of energy, but with quiet reverence. One by one, others followed. Leo, the baker, the librarian, the fisherman from the docks. Soon the entire room was on its feet, not cheering, not whistling, just standing in shared stillness as if to say, "We heard you. We felt it, thank you." Ilara opened her eyes, saw the room, and for the first time that night she smiled, small, fragile, real. Julian didn't move. He couldn't, his body felt heavy as if rooted to the floor. Shame washed over him, not sharp and sudden, but deep and slow like tide pulling sand from under your feet. He hadn't just been wrong. He'd been blind. He thought of the things he'd said, the dismissive comments, the cold certainty that only trained hands could make true music. And now, standing in the shadow of a lullaby played on a broken piano by a florist in a simple dress, he saw the arrogance of it all. Music wasn't a fortress to be guarded by the elite. It was a language anyone could speak, if they had something true to say. Backstage, he sank onto a wooden stool, his hands trembling slightly. Not from fatigue, from feeling. Later, as the crowd began to disperse, lingering to talk, to hug Ilara, to thank her, the librarian approached him. "You played beautifully," she said gently. He shook his head. "I played correctly." She played truth. The woman didn't argue. She just nodded as if she'd known all along. Outside, the night air was cool. Stars blinked above the harbor. People walked home in pairs and groups, their voices low, their steps unhurried. The duel was over. But no one spoke of winners or losers. They spoke of how the music made them feel, of memories it stirred, of loved ones they wished were there to hear it. Ilara stayed behind to help pack up. She ran her fingers over the upright piano one last time before they wheeled it back to the community center. She didn't look for Julian. She didn't need to. She'd said what she needed to say, but Julian didn't leave. He stood near the stage watching her from a distance. When she finally turned to go, he stepped forward. "Ilara," he said, his voice quieter than usual. She stopped, turned, didn't smile but didn't look away. I didn't know," he said, struggling for words. "I thought music was about getting it right, but you made it about being real." She studied him for a long moment. "Music doesn't care about right or wrong," she said softly. "It only cares if you're honest," he nodded. Couldn't speak. She walked past him but paused at the door. "If you ever want to learn the lullaby," she said without turning, "you're welcome to come by the shop. I open at 7. Then she stepped out into the night. Julian stood alone in the empty hall. The grand piano sat silent. The chairs were stacked. The lights were dimmed. But the air still hummed with what had happened there. Not a duel, but a revelation. He walked back to his guest house slowly, his polished shoes clicking against the cobblestones. For the first time in years, he didn't rehearse music in his head. He just listened, to the waves, to the wind, to the quiet pulse of a town that had taught him more in one evening than decades of concert halls ever had. And when he reached his room, he didn't open his sheet music. He sat by the window, looked out at the sea, and let himself feel the weight of his own silence. Because sometimes, the most powerful note isn't the one you play, it's the one you finally hear. The morning after the duel, Julian didn't wake to his usual routine. No metronome ticking on the nightstand, no mental run-through of scales, no checking emails from his manager about rehearsal schedules. Instead, he lay in bed listening to the sound of gulls and the distant creak of fishing boats swaying in the harbor. His body felt heavy, not from exhaustion but from something deeper. Like he'd been carrying a weight he hadn't known was there. And now that it was gone, he didn't know how to stand straight. He hadn't slept much. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard it again. That lullaby, simple and soft, wrapping around the room like a blanket. Not because it was complex or clever, but because it was honest. And that honesty had cracked something open inside him, something he'd sealed off years ago in the name of perfection. By mid-morning, he still hadn't left his room. His phone buzzed twice, once from his manager, once from his agent. He ignored both. He knew what they'd say. Brilliant performance. Audiences loved it. Ready for Vienna? But none of that felt real anymore. What felt real was the silence in the cultural hall after Alara played. The way people didn't clap right away. The way they just stayed. He finally got up, dressed in plain clothes, no suit, no starched collar, and walked to the bakery. He ordered black coffee and a plain roll, then sat by the window. Outside, life moved at its usual pace. A fisherman mended nets. A boy chased a dog down the lane. An elderly couple shared a bench, holding hands without speaking. Nothing dramatic. Nothing polished. Just life happening quietly. And for the first time, Julian didn't feel above it. He felt part of it. That afternoon, he went to the community center. The door was unlocked. The upright piano sat in the corner, bathed in afternoon light. He approached it slowly, as if it might vanish if he moved too fast. He sat, placed his hands on the keys, and tried to play the lullaby from memory. It fell apart almost immediately. His fingers, trained for speed and precision, fumbled over the simple melody. He played the right notes, but they sounded hollow, like a photocopy of a photograph, technically accurate but missing the soul. He tried again, slower this time, but it still felt wrong. He wasn't playing to anyone. He was playing at the music, like it was a puzzle to solve rather than a feeling to share. Frustrated, he slammed the piano lid shut. The sound echoed in the empty room. He ran a hand through his hair, breathing hard. It wasn't fair. He'd spent his life mastering the instrument, and yet this untrained florist could say more in 3 minutes than he ever had in 3 hours. But then it hit him. It wasn't about the instrument. It was about the heart behind it. He sat back down, opened the lid gently this time, didn't play, just stared at the keys. And for the first time, he asked himself a question he'd never dared to ask before. Why do I play? Not for fame, not for critics, not even for the music itself. He played because, as a lonely child in a silent house, the piano had been the only thing that answered when he spoke. It had held his sadness, his joy, his confusion. But somewhere along the way, between conservatory auditions and international tours, he'd stopped speaking to it. He'd started performing for it instead of with it, and in doing so, he'd lost his voice. The next morning, just before dawn, he walked to Alara's flower shop. It wasn't open yet, but he saw a light on in the back room. He waited on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, unsure if he'd even knock. When the door finally opened, she stood there, apron tied, hair loose, holding a watering can. She didn't look surprised. "You're early." "I couldn't sleep," he said. She studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in. The shop smelled of earth petals and morning air. Bunches of lavender, roses, and wildflowers hung drying from the ceiling. A radio played softly in the corner, just static and an occasional folk tune. She poured 2 mugs of tea and sat at a small wooden table near the window. "I don't know how to play like you do," he said finally, staring into his cup. "I can play anything on paper, but I can't say anything." Ilara didn't offer empty comfort. "You don't learn to speak by copying someone else's words," she said. "You learn by finding your own." "But what if I forgot how?" "Then you start small, like a child. 1 note at a time." He looked up. "Will you teach me?" She hesitated, not out of reluctance but caution. "I'm not a teacher. You don't have to be. Just show me how you listen." She nodded slowly. "Come back tomorrow, same time. And leave your pride at the door." He did. Every morning for the next week, Julian arrived before sunrise. Ilara would be arranging flowers or brewing tea. They'd sit in silence for a few minutes, then move to the community center, where the old piano waited. She never gave him sheet music. Instead, she'd play a phrase, just 3 or 4 notes, and ask him to repeat it not with his fingers, but with his breath. "Sing it first," she'd say. "If you can't sing it, you don't feel it." At first, he resisted. Singing felt undignified, vulnerable. But slowly, he began to understand. Music wasn't just in the hands. It started in the chest, in the throat, in the quiet space between heartbeats. One morning, she played the opening of the lullaby and asked him to respond. Not by copying, but by answering. "What does it say to you?" she asked. He sat for a long time. Then tentatively, he played a single low note, deep, resonant, like a question. She smiled. "Now you're listening." Meanwhile, the outside world hadn't stopped turning. His manager called daily, growing more alarmed. "The Vienna concert is in 10 days. Where are you? Are you ill?" Julian finally answered. "I'm not coming." There was a long pause. "Julian, do you understand what you're giving up?" He did, and for the first time he didn't care. News of his decision spread quietly through the classical music world. Some called him a fool. Others whispered that he'd gone soft. But in Marlowe, no one batted an eye. To them, it made perfect sense. You don't walk away from truth once you've found it. Back at the guest house, Julian began clearing out his formal clothes. He donated his concert shoes to a local theater group. He packed away his scores, not to throw them out, but to make room for something new. One evening, as he walked home from the community center, he passed the harbor. A group of teenagers sat on the pier, strumming a guitar and laughing. One of them was trying to play a melody by ear, getting it wrong over and over. Instead of correcting him, his friends cheered each time he got a note right. Julian stopped and listened. It was messy, off-key, beautiful. He sat on a nearby bench and stayed until the stars came out. At the flower shop, Ilara noticed the change in him, not just in his playing, but in his presence. He no longer carried himself like someone above the world. He asked about her grandmother, remembered Leo's favorite flower, sunflowers, offered to carry heavy pots without being asked. He still spoke little, but when he did, it was real. One rainy afternoon, as they sat listening to the downpour drumming on the roof, she asked, "Do you miss it? The big stages?" He thought for a long time. "I miss the sound of a grand piano in a perfect hall," he admitted. "But I don't miss the loneliness," she nodded. "Music isn't meant to be alone." "No," he said softly. "It's meant to be shared." By the end of the second week, Julian played the lullaby all the way through. Not perfectly, but with feeling. When he finished, Ilara didn't clap. She just said, "Now it's yours." That night, he dreamed of his childhood piano, the one in his parents' living room, slightly out of tune, with a chip in the wood from when he'd slammed the lid in frustration at age 10. In the dream, he sat down and played not for judges or teachers, but for his younger self. And for the first time in years, he felt whole. The next morning, he didn't go to the flower shop. Instead, he went to the cultural hall. He sat at the grand piano, the same one he'd played on during the duel, and began to improvise. Not Liszt, not Chopin, just notes that came from somewhere quiet inside him. A melody about loss, about shame, about grace. When he finished, he realized someone had been listening. Mrs. Callahan stood in the doorway, holding a small pot of violets. "You sound different," she said. "I feel different," he replied. She placed the flowers on the piano. Arthur would have liked that. He didn't know what to say. So he just nodded. Later that day, he called his manager one last time. "I'm staying," he said. "Not forever, maybe. But for now." There was silence on the line. Then quietly, "Are you happy?" He looked out the window at the harbor, the gulls, the flower shop down the lane. "I'm becoming something better than happy," he said. "I'm becoming human." And in that moment, Julian Voss didn't think about technique or legacy or applause. He thought about the next morning when he'd wake before dawn, walk to the shop and sit with a woman who taught him that music isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. 6 months had passed since the night of the piano duel, and Marlowe felt different, not because anything grand had changed, but because something quiet had taken root. The kind of change that doesn't announce itself with fanfare, but settles in like morning light through a window, slow and steady and warm. Julian still lived in the same guest house, though it no longer felt temporary. His suitcase sat unpacked in the closet, not because he'd forgotten to put things away, but because he'd stopped thinking of his stay as a pause between tours. The metronome gathered dust on the shelf. In its place sat a small clay pot with a sprig of lavender, Ilara's doing, left on his doorstep one spring morning with no note, just a knowing smile when he thanked her the next day. He no longer practiced alone. Most mornings he walked to the community center before sunrise, not to rehearse for an audience, but to sit beside children who were just learning to press keys without fear. He didn't correct their mistakes unless they asked. Instead, he'd say, "What did that note feel like?" Or if that chord had a color, what would it be? At first, the kids looked at him like he was strange. But soon they began to answer. Blue like rain, warm like toast, and sad like missing my dog. And in those answers, Julian found something he'd lost. Music as discovery, not demonstration. He also started volunteering at the center twice a week, teaching basic piano to anyone who showed up, retirees, teenagers, even a fisherman who wanted to play something for his granddaughter's birthday. He didn't call himself a teacher. He called himself a listener. And in listening, he learned more than he ever had on stage. Ilara's flower shop had changed too. A small chalkboard now hung by the door. Piano and pedals, every other Thursday 6 p.m. On those evenings, the shop stayed open late. People brought their own instruments, a guitar, a flute, an old harmonica, or just their voices. Ilara played the upright piano in the corner while others shared songs, poems, or simply sat in the quiet company of others. No one performed. No one judged. They just gathered like people used to do before screens and schedules stole the art of being together. Julian came to every session. Sometimes he played. Sometimes he just watered the plants and listened. One night, a young woman sang a song she'd written about losing her brother. Her voice cracked on the last line. No one clapped. Julian handed her a tissue. She nodded. That was enough. The idea for the concert came not from ambition but from a conversation on the harbor pier one evening. Ilara was tying bundles of sea lavender for a wedding the next day. Julian sat beside her watching the tide roll in. "What if we played together?" he asked almost casually. She looked up. "Where?" "Here in the park, just for everyone." She considered it. "No stage?" "No stage. No tickets. Just 2 pianos and whoever wants to listen." She smiled. "I'd like that. They didn't plan much. No press releases, no posters beyond a few hand-drawn signs taped to lampposts. Word spread the old-fashioned way. Through conversations at the bakery, notes tucked into flower bouquets, whispers between neighbors. They're playing together Saturday night. Bring a blanket." The day of the concert dawned clear and mild. Volunteers from the town set up 2 pianos side by side on the grass near the old oak tree. Julian's grand piano, borrowed from the cultural hall, and Ilara's upright, polished but still proudly imperfect. Strings of fairy lights were strung between trees. Folding chairs were arranged, but most people brought their own blankets and picnic baskets. By sunset, the park was full, not packed like a festival, but comfortably crowded like a family reunion. Julian wore a simple navy sweater and dark trousers. Ilara wore a dress the color of sage, her hair loose, a single white rose tucked behind her ear. They didn't speak much before they began. They didn't need to. Julian went first. He played a shortened, gentler version of Debussy's Clair de Lune, not the concert hall version he once would have delivered, but something softer, slower, as if the moonlight itself were brushing the keys. There were no showy runs, no dramatic pauses. Just clarity, just calm. When he finished, the audience didn't erupt in applause. They exhaled as if they'd been holding their breath. Then Alara played her lullaby. But this time it wasn't alone. Halfway through, Julian joined her, not with a grand entrance, but with a single low note that wrapped around her melody like an arm around a shoulder. They'd practiced only twice, but it felt like they'd been playing together for years. Their styles didn't blend so much as hold each other. His precision giving her warmth a frame, her tenderness giving his control a heart. When the last note faded, no one moved. Then Leo, now 8 and braver, stood up and clapped. One by one, others joined, not out of obligation, but gratitude. They ended with something unplanned. Julian started a simple progression in C major. Alara answered with a folk tune she'd learned from her grandmother. From there they wandered, improvising, listening, responding. It wasn't perfect. At one point, Julian missed a chord change. Alara laughed softly and played a trill to cover it. He grinned and followed her lead. And in that moment, the music became exactly what it was meant to be. A conversation between two people who had finally learned to speak the same language. Afterward, people lingered. Children ran barefoot through the grass. Couples shared wine from paper cups. An old man played harmonica while his wife swayed gently beside him. Julian and Alara sat on the edge of the stage platform, sipping tea from mismatched mugs. "You played like you were home," Alara said quietly. "I am," he replied. A few weeks later, Julian received a letter from a music school in the city. They'd heard about his work in Marlow and invited him to lead a new program, Music for Connection, a course focused not on competition, but on community, empathy, and emotional expression through sound. He thought about it for days. In the past, he would have said yes without hesitation. Another prestigious title, another line on his resume. But now he weighed it differently. He declined. Not out of rejection, but clarity. "What I'm learning here," he wrote back, "can't be taught in a classroom. It has to be lived." Instead, he proposed something else, a traveling workshop. Once a month, he and Alara would visit schools, shelters, and community centers across the region, bringing pianos, flowers, and the simple idea that music belongs to everyone. The first stop was a children's hospital. Julian played while Alara handed out small bouquets to patients. One little girl, bawled from treatment, asked if she could press a key. He lifted her onto the bench. She played one note, then another. Her mother cried, not from sadness, but from seeing her daughter smile for the first time in weeks. Back in Marlow, life settled into a new rhythm. Julian still played every day, but now he played for Mrs. Callahan on her porch, for Leo before school, for the stray cat that liked to nap under the piano. He no longer thought of himself as a concert pianist. He just thought of himself as someone who played piano, and that was enough. Alara kept her shop but added a small shelf of second-hand sheet music and a notebook where people could write down songs they loved. Sometimes Julian would find a new melody scribbled in the book and learn it just to play it for her the next morning. One evening, as they sat on the harbor wall watching the sun dip below the water, Alara asked, "Do you ever miss the old life?" Julian watched a fishing boat glide into the distance. "I miss the sound of a perfect haul," he said. "But I don't miss feeling alone in it." She nodded. "Music was never meant to be a mountain you climb by yourself. It's a fire you build together." He smiled. "Then I guess I've been cold my whole life." Not anymore, and he wasn't. In Marlow, he'd found something rarer than fame or flawless technique: belonging. Not because he was the best, but because he was willing to be real, willing to listen, willing to sit in the messiness of human feeling and let it shape the music instead of the other way around. Years later, when people in the town spoke of that summer, they didn't talk about the duel. They talked about the nights that followed, the shared songs, the open doors, the way music became a bridge instead of a barrier. They talked about how a man who once saw music as a fortress learned to turn it into a home, and how a woman who never thought she was good enough reminded everyone that the truest art isn't measured in notes, but in how it makes you feel less alone. Julian never called himself changed. He knew change wasn't a single moment, but a daily choice, to stay open, to stay humble, to keep listening. And every morning when he walked past the flower shop and saw Alara arranging roses with the radio playing softly in the background, He made that choice again, because in the end, music wasn't about perfection, it was about presence. And in the quiet coastal town of Marlow, two imperfect people had found a way to play it together, one honest note at a time.